most people in society are run by ideologies. They're run by gestalts, good or bad. The leaders in societies aren't the people who act on the individuals to change them. They're the people who act on the gestalts to change them. The leaders know how to wield gestalts because they know that that's the actual organization of human society. And that's what they're intervening on. That you do that, you move the population, for good or for bad. First thing, actually, and this is funny, it's going to seem roundabout, but there's a rationale to it. I was reading a book on virology because I had been reading all this stuff by Gurevich and all of these mitogenic field guys, mitogenic radiation guys, morphogenetic field guys. And they have this big thing that say, okay, well, there must be fields involved in biology. But then what they do is they look at the living field and they try and map it out with, like, you know, figuring out where the electric fields were and where the magnetic fields were. But I thought that was funny because if you want to figure out what an electric field is doing, you don't use iron filings, right? You do that for magnetic fields. So if you want to figure out what an electric field is doing, you use some charged particles. But why would you use either one to figure out what a living field is doing? Wouldn't you use something that responds to a living field? So I thought, you know, wow, that's it. You know, viruses, these prions, mycoplasmas, they've got these, there's all these little living particles that do respond to living processes. They only act when they're living processes. So I tried to get this book and read it, and it turned out the lady was, at least by default, by the fact of her working in a modern university, was a big Nazi sympathizer. I'm like reading through it. She keeps having these descriptions of these these researchers, and she'll say, you know, for an unbiased account of his often controversial but always colorful career, read this book. And you're like, my first thought, the first time she said it, I thought, wow, you know, often controversial but always colorful. That sounds like the kind of guy I'd like to know more about. So I started reading about it, and there was this guy, Alexis Carrel, she was describing, who becomes the head for the, I forget the title, but it's got one of those, Society for the Solution of Human Problems, that's what it was, Solution of Human Problems, for Vichy, France. And so I realized, no, something's wrong with this guy, something wrong. So, and he was it turns out, he was a big promoter of eugenics way before the Nazis. That's his big claim to fame, that he was on top of eugenics before it became, you know, politically popular. And the more I read about him, the bigger freak he was. Oh, I didn't tell you this part, though. Okay, first I found out he was a big freak because he's best friends with Charles Lindbergh. So he's part of the network that's trying to overthrow Roosevelt here in the U.S. Not just that they're pro-Nazi, but they're trying to stop the Nazi opposition here. But then, this is good, his other dear friend, living in France at the same time, is this Russian scientist whose name I forget now. But he was this like independently wealthy guy of Russian extraction living in France. And his claim to fame was that Alexis Carrel was tissue culture, trying to grow these tissues outside of living bodies. This guy figured out how to do these grafting techniques. And his claim to fame became, he had some whole theory about how the source of all of your youth and life and virility was your testicles. And you just needed to, if you were like weak or having any kind of problem, all you need to do was improve your testicular fortitude. So he developed this technique for grafting testicular material off of other people's testicles and adding them to folks' testicles. So he started this business of getting the testicles of executed criminals and grafting them onto millionaires. So he's like, you know, he'll wait as soon as they're dead, so while the testicles are still, you know, living material, taking shavings off, and then these millionaires are going under the knife, having the scrotum opened up and having the testicular material grafted on. But it became such a big hit throughout Europe that supply outpaced demand. So they didn't have enough people being executed in order to graft these criminals' testicles. This is in the 20s, to graft these criminal testicles onto these millionaires. So he came up with another study that showed that there wasn't much difference between human testicles and monkey testicles. So you had this big craze of these millionaires going to get monkey testicular material grafted onto their testicles to increase their virility. And apparently it was this huge hit for like a decade until somebody followed up. Somebody actually did this follow-up study to like trace all of his patients, and it turned out that, you know, none of them were aging slower or getting more virile. It was all psychosomatic. So then it was a big fallout. He fell out of favor. And there was some speculation in the 90s that he might have caused the AIDS virus by grafting monkey testicles onto people's human beings' testicles. So, but anyway, these guys are all the same people, Alexis Carrel. So I started realizing that that's probably not the avenue I wanted to pursue in the investigations of biology. So finally, and she mentioned another guy who was this. There's another Japanese guy, and she said, it's World War II Japanese guy, so alarm bells are kind of going off. But then she says, again, often controversial, but always colorful. So, then you're real serious trepidation there. So I look in to see what this guy did. I forget his name. I should look it up to be sure. But his claim to fame, he did all this research on the effects of viruses on people by infecting orphans and poor people with deadly viruses, and then seeing how the virus unfolded. And that was his great research work. So then I realized this woman's nuts. She's writing this thing. She doesn't make any mention. Then all of her main characters, who she thinks are the best, they all first moved to Pasadena, which was the eugenics center for the U.S. Then after that, they all moved to Cold Springs Harbor, which was the other center of eugenics for the United States. And these are all of her great biologists who are studying virology. So, then I'm real nervous, like, what am I reading? So finally, she starts talking about this guy, William Roux. And she says that William Roux, she sings his praises about how he's, his work was the breakthrough work on making biology a science with the work that he was doing in embryology. So I knew by this point that this guy must be evil as sin, or there's some serious problem. There's something wrong with him if this woman is promoting him. So I found that he was having that during his lifetime, he had a big controversy, a big conflict with another embryologist named Hans Driesch, who'd come shortly after Roux. And it was known, so I figured, okay, well, Driesch is like the arch enemy of this guy Roux, so Driesch must be sane. Driesch is the arch enemy of Roux. This woman likes Roux. There's a very likely that the enemy of your enemy is not always your friend, but I figured we had pretty decent odds in this case, and it was correct. At the same time, we were working on translations of Vernadsky, Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, and then two things came up. One, turns out Driesch is friends with Vernadsky. Second, Vernadsky mentions Köhler in Wolfgang Köhler in kind of a funny context. I'd known Köhler just from Lynn's references, which were, he was a psychologist. He had this idea of the Gestalt. It was very cool. We discussed, we'd used it as a polemic before in the past, even as a youth movement. But I thought his main work was with these monkeys, with these apes. But then Vernadsky has this funny thing, because the whole book of Vernadsky papers that we're translating is about the shape of physical space-time. And Vernadsky's assessment of Köhler's work is that Köhler had laid out what Vernadsky was talking about in describing the shape of physical space-time experimentally in his work on vision and hearing, and that he did it by applying field theory. And all of that was new to me. I had no idea that was anywhere in Köhler. So, of course, I decided to go get some books. And first I read a speech of his where Köhler is talking about how in discussions, Köhler describes how discussions that he had personally with Max Planck, in those discussions, Planck said that Köhler's Gestalt work would clarify a recent problem that had occurred, a paradox that had occurred with respect to the quantum, and it would clarify that, if not the very idea of the quantum itself. And so I thought, that's great. It's what we've been, we've said that in discussions, that this idea of a Gestalt, these processes that you get that are normal to the human mind's operation, only seem foreign or what appear in physics. They appear in quantum phenomena in physics, and they only seem foreign to the extent that you think that the physical phenomena is supposed to be something completely distinct from living phenomena, or completely distinct from cognitive phenomena, but even living phenomena. So that was neat, and to realize that Köhler was self-conscious of this was was an exciting discovery. But then to find out that you've got this whole sort of network. Köhler knows Driesch. You've got this whole sort of interesting grouping that's here at the turn of the last century. So at the late 19th century into about midway to the 20th century, you've got this whole group of epistemologically solid holdouts to this takeover of empiricism, logical positivism, all these lunatic trends that you had emerging in the post-World War II period, post-World War I, but then more seriously in the post-World War II period. You had all these people, a lot of them in the U.S., other ones in Europe, who were resisting this. And naturally, because of fascism taking over in Europe and the resistance to fascism here, the better people concentrated themselves here in the U.S. So we had a real density of thinkers here who all were of the proper epistemological frame of mind that they would oppose fascism as a policy. But the ones who would oppose fascism as a policy, you know, a good subset of those who weren't opposed to fascism on just technical points, but for principled reasons, those guys, you recognize that their epistemology in the field of science was something you could recognize as a modern form of classical humanism. The classical humanism of a Kepler, of a Kuza, of a Leibniz, that they were expressions of this, in some cases, in their direct relationship to these people. Lynn mentioned Pasteur, who worked directly with Vernadsky. So Vernadsky is not foreign to that whole tradition. Vernadsky is directly tied into it. Curler's, one of his main teachers, besides Max Planck, of course, who's already tied into this whole German classical tradition, Curler has, you know, you sort of say the intellectual grandchild of people who were in Riemann's direct networks. People like Gustav Theodor Fechner, the Weber brothers, both the Weber brothers, Wilhelm Weber on the electrodynamics, and Ernst Weber, two of the three, Wilhelm and Ernst Weber, Ernst, who was working with Fechner on some of the psychology work, that this is what Curler's coming out of. The approach that you had pushed by, and all of them I could lump together, the empiricists of the time, the radical, the logical positivists of that time period, the behaviorists in psychology, the people promoting digital systems over analog systems. And these are all the same people. Like, the degree of overlap would shock you, I think, or it surprised me. You got the same people pushing everything. The guys who are pushing for reductionist biology are also the ones promoting digital systems instead of analog. This you get from Wiener. Sort of naturally, the behaviorists have a view that the human mind is a machine, so it's not a surprise that their interest would be primarily digital processes, because those are the processes they're trying to superimpose on the human thought process. So it's this one, you realize that there, as Lynn says, a slime mold. You get one real nasty anti-humanist grouping. And so naturally the opposition becomes an across-the-board humanist grouping. So you get people like Curler's background is classical composition. Like one of his major backgrounds is classical composition. Like this is what he comes back to when he discusses psychology. This is what he means. You know, it's not psychopathology. It's not, you know, did you want to sleep with your mother? And, you know, when you have a dream about stick on a tree, is it really, you know, your deformed phallic genitalia or whatever? It's not that stuff. What he means by psychology is, well, you know, how does the human mind operate? You know, what is a creative thought process? We know as an empirical fact, as a fact of observation and experience, that the human mind is capable of responding to classical composition and transforming the way it thinks in other fields because of its response to that. Now Curler says, well, why? Well, what about this? What phenomena here are universal? And he starts investigating, and he can reduce it down to where you've got real experimental controls, real experimental variables, where you're able to isolate certain phenomena that's universal, say to all sense perception, or say to all phenomena of memory. And in the course of doing that, he starts realizing that the characteristic of these processes are gestalts. The word gestalt meaning form or shape in German, carried over into English is the word gestalt, which borrows some of the more the broader significance of the German word Gestalt. But in psychology, it's the mind's ability to recognize processes as unitary wholes. And for Curler in physics, it meant that processes were unitary wholes. A physical gestalt is a whole that governs all of its underlying processes. And he says this is actually fundamental in physics, contrary to the reductionist assertion that the universe is ultimately reducible to particles in the very, very small that will account for the behavior in the large. He said that's not true. That's an assumption. And in fact, a study of physical phenomena disproves that. And so you've got this split, and it's largely around that. Interesting enough, they all converge upon as their one study that sort of everybody's got their hands in is embryology, which was what Driesch was sort of the second pioneer. Roux begins it, but then Driesch is the one who really develops it. Though both Curler and Vernadsky have their criticisms of Driesch, it's continued by one of Driesch's contemporaries, a guy named Spemann, Hans Spemann. But what they're all looking at is that in the development of a living organism, from one cell, one relatively simply organized cell, it's something that could be a unit of an entire living process, you get from that one cell the complexity that's of the entire living process. It eventually unfolds to be one whole, complex, incredibly complicated living organism, constructed of an uncountable number of cells like itself, like that original cell. So the question is, how do you get that kind of complexity? How do you get that sort of ordered whole emerging from the very, very small, sort of the biological infinitesimal, you could say? And so they're all fascinated looking at this. And again, it comes to what the term a lot of them use is field theory, and it gets conflated though with what I think is the more substantial point that Curler focuses on, which is potential theory, which that was the area of study that you had that again Riemann was looking at, and Riemann was looking at in conjunction with all these researchers who were connected to Curler's history, with the Webers, Fechner, Herbart, and this whole circle of psychologists and biologists around Riemann. And what you've got when you're looking at potential is you're looking at these processes that represent dynamic wholes. And these processes where every bit and piece of that process is interrelated, acting on each other, as though with the entirety of their interaction in mind. And so this becomes the rallying cry, the organizing point for all these thinkers. The opposition is what's opposed to that. The opposition of the folks who are saying, well, this is not true. Ultimately, what you think you're doing, you think that living processes are something unique, and you think that you're thinking, right? You think that you're something unique, but really, if we analyzed you enough, we'd be able to explain everything you're doing from the fact that you're made up of the same particles as that little piece of rock over there is made up of. That you just happen to be organized in such a way that you get this weird phenomenon that seems like thinking, but fundamentally you're not really different than that rock. And these are reductionists, and this is what Curler and this whole grouping oppose. But this is what was sweeping the United States at that time. In this period in the 30s, Curler gets here and he says that he was shocked to see that behaviorism was so rampant in psychology. Now we know this is largely that approach has taken over. It's been somewhat sophisticated into neurobiology and all cognitive science and all these other, the so-called modern reductionist fields in psychology. But as far as the sort of the political and sociological intent, it's the same as what you have with behaviorism in Curler's time, what Curler was fighting. Lynn would bring up dynamics, and we had all this stuff, and everybody real quick was quick to jump on, yeah, dynamics. It's just dynamic, because it sounds like a good word, right? It's better to be dynamic than, like, I don't know, like lethargic or static. Seems like the opposite of dynamic would be incredibly uninteresting. So everybody, but then you have to look at it. You look at what Leibniz is saying when he says dynamics. He's got there's a few key papers where he's elaborating on this, and we've got a team that's currently right now working on translating the book that he wrote on it. But the key points in his dynamics are they're not what you'd expect Then when you realize what they are, they make perfect sense. But initially, they're not what you'd expect. One is this idea of final cause. That any system, in reality, I mean, sometimes he'll give it, any system, you could say, can be approached, but it actually does unfold as though it has its end. Even these are abiotic systems, too. These aren't necessarily just, it's a case in biology, it's a case in cognition, obviously. Because in cognition, what does it mean to will something? To act willfully in cognition means that you have your end goal in sight. You have an intent in mind, and you're acting in order to unfold that intent. That's will. That's free will. So in a sense, free will transcends simple temporal causality. You unfold it temporally. You unfold it such that your action, you take an action now to affect something, to affect something, to affect something. But what's governing the creation of that first activity is some future state of the whole process. And you see it also in biology. That's very clear in the case of the development of the embryo. Also in the case of evolution on a planetary scale. On a planetary scale, you get this idea of a very complex end result that's not contained in any of the prior states. But the prior states develop themselves and move as though they've got that final state in mind. And what's significant is that the whole process moves like that. It's not like, some ant figures out that, well, wouldn't it be neat? You watch these videos of these bugs have developed the most complex interrelations where, there's some bug that lifts a wing up and it looks like an ant and it can sneak into a little ant hill and you're like, well, either that bug innovated that sometime, really one of its ancestors, through a series of random mutations, tried out a bunch of stuff, The first time it turned into an anteater and it couldn't get in the anthill, and I thought, well, that one didn't work. And, the next time it turned itself into like raid, and that didn't work. The ants freaked out again. And, like the last time it finally got it right, and it was an ant. There was clearly not some hypothesis taking place inside the insect itself, but the whole thing was sort of organized in order to be able to interact, for each piece to act with every other piece. So you get two phenomena together, that the process behaves as though it sees at every point the end, so it sort of spread itself across time at every moment, and it behaves as though every part of it sees the whole. So it's not localized in space and not localized in time. So it's sort of already, with any of these processes, you're sort of scrapping the Euclidean Cartesian idea of space-time, that there's some space box called space and some box called time where things unfold in. And instead you've got something that is dynamic, that's based on the whole, these wholes interacting with each other, these gestalts interacting with one another. And that's the basis of Leibniz's dynamics. That this idea of what he calls final cause, that a process acts as though it knows its end state. And this is what the point he makes about Fermat's principle of least time. That in least time, light organizes itself as though it knows where it's going to end up. It knows where it's going to end up, despite the fact that it hasn't hit the surface, it's going to refract it. Despite the fact that it has not yet been refracted, the light is organized as though it knows where its ending point is going to be, and it will take the least time to get from the beginning to the end point. But now that also means something else. It knows when it's going to hit the water that will refract it. Since it knows that, that means that you've got the same thing you had again with evolution. You've got a process that, say, at what you might call its beginning state, which you would want to say causally creates the end state, already knows what the end state is going to be. So the end state is determining what it is, and at the same time it knows what the entire set of boundary conditions are that it's operating in. So it's operating with the whole in mind and with it both spatially and temporally. So your process is neither localized temporally or spatially. And that's your dynamics. And now how do you perform an analysis recognizing that something is not delimited, there's no Cartesian space and time in which something operates. Now your Newtonian physics, your Newtonian analysis of it physically won't function. You need a new analysis. This is Leibniz's dynamics. And you can see just, I think from just that description, that what you're dealing with is exactly the same kind of Gestalt phenomena that Curler's talking about. It's his physical Gestalt and his psychological Gestalt. It's the beginning of that. It is dynamic. You're looking, you're saying, okay, well, the solar system organizes itself as a whole. The solar system is the solar system. It's a unit. All the little interactions taking place in the solar system are what are necessary in order to have the whole behave the way the whole behaves.
Yeah.
So you've got this, what happens in the small is determined by what's happening in the large. It's defined by what's happening in the large. In the same way as, well, and so you start to realize the fallacy. It's clear, it's funny, because then you get a reductionist, like a Newton, who's just a retooled, a British version of Descartes. You get somebody like Newton or one of his controllers, Haley or one of these people, who says, well, I'm going to ignore that. What Kepler did is, this is crazy, this is mysticism, he's got to talk about mind all the time and holes. Really, the universe is a bunch of hard balls that could care less about your morality, your beauty, and all this stuff. That's a human construction. These hard balls, what does a little ball know about? Balls know nothing about beauty. So I'm going to figure out how, if I were to reconstruct that whole solar system from the standpoint of these balls, what would have to be the principle there? So he derives this, that there must be these forces, which is the most occult thing you can imagine. What the hell is a force? You got forces between these balls. We got these forces, and I can mathematically describe how they act. They act as though their effectiveness is diminishing with the inversely with the square of the distance between the two objects. And you say, okay, well, it's true. You can derive that from Kepler's hole. So now the task is, can you build that solar system back up? If that really is a piece of that solar system, can you build that same solar system up from those individual forces? And then you try, and as soon as you get 3 pieces in there, the whole thing falls apart. You've got the 3-body problem. It's not possible to put these forces together and get a whole solar system there, even though you can derive the forces from the whole. If you start off with the whole, you can say that you can sort of derive these little pieces there. And so then they have a panic, and it becomes a big thing, and you've got these lunatics with these supercomputers trying to solve the in-body problem, and just making a bigger and bigger mess of it. When Kepler solved it immediately by trying to figure out what's a single idea that is organizing this process as a whole. And it's funny, and it seems initially paradoxical, but it's not really. If you take the example of a line. If you take a piece out of a line anywhere, you take a line and intersect it with another line, you get a point. Everywhere in that line, you get an intersection, you get a separate point in that line. So you say, well, since I can find points in that line, the line must be made of points. But then what happens when you try sticking the points together and making your line back again? Right? A point is that which has no length. So how many 0 lengths do you need to add in order to get a length back again? And you get the same problem again, that even in the simple case of geometry, the whole exists as an independent idea. It's not the sum of its parts. In that sense, it's in that very specific sense, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And you get the same thing in physics. You realize that the universe as a whole is dynamic, that it's not built up of these little interactions in the pieces. There seems to be this incredibly complex interaction. There is this incredibly complex interaction between the pieces, but not because the pieces themselves are determining that independently. It's because they're acting with the entire process in mind. And that's the case in physics, that's the case in biology, it's the case in psychology. When Curler comes on the scene, he gives it the name of Gestalt. In Leibniz's day, it was dynamics. Yeah, it's definitely there. I mean, it's a case. Empire is a sort of evil Gestalt. And it's funny, you get it too, because you get, most of these imperialists, I mean, you take a look at your average British imperialist, and then sort of like the ratchet down of it to the wannabe American imperialist. All these guys aren't representing national interests. These American, quote-unquote American, the people like George Bush, people like Dick Cheney, more importantly, people like George Soros, some of these George Shultz, these financiers, they don't represent the United States as an idea. They're not American. But they're also not independent agents. They've got there's no creative thought that exists inside of them. There's a certain kind of cleverness they have, but they respond as though they're particles in a field. They respond in the same way. They're these little independent particles that are governed by the idea of empire. Which, if you were to ask them to, give you a dissertation on it and explain what their species characteristic was, they probably couldn't. They might be able to like sort of grumble the word kill, lunge at you across the room or something like that. Or maybe Schultz could give you like a dissertation on free trade and then, then try to kill somebody else somewhere else. But they wouldn't be able to speak intelligently about, what they are, but they're governed by it. Their entire species characteristic, every one of their individual actions is governed by this idea that's acting on them as though from the outside, this one gestalt of empire. And in that sense, empire has no location. It's got it's not any sort of nation. A nation is not an empire. It's sort of a disease. It's one single idea that's spread throughout history and will localize itself at different times within, sort of nominally take on nations, but then it'll destroy that nation in a second and move on to something else. Empire is just in the same way. The real classical humanist tradition that we represent is also a gestalt. It's a single idea, and it's the idea that human beings naturally respond to. Which is why, for instance, in the course of our organizing, you can put out classical ideas about human nature, the organization of human economy, classical culture, real classical science, and in the course of putting that out, people respond to it even if they don't know everything about the subject matter they're talking about. People respond to classical composition who don't know how to compose classically. Right? You don't have to be a composer like Beethoven to respond to what he's writing. What he's got is he's able to act on humanity as a gestalt. He's able to evoke a response from the human part of you. And you get this idea, and you get human beings able to respond to the fact that they're part of something, this larger thing called humanity, this larger gestalt called humanity. And so you've got this clash between a real humanist tradition and this sort of parasitical thing that's been attached to it called empire. And right now we're at the point of either being able to eradicate empire as a gestalt, as an idea, to eliminate it once and for all, or to be dragged down into the abyss with it. Because its structures are melting down. The society that it latched itself onto is collapsing. You're watching the meltdown of the financial markets. This entire system that's been built up under the name of free trade is disintegrating under its own weight. The question is whether we, who have become attached to the American population who's become attached to that, the world population that's become attached to it, is going to go down with it. Because at this rate, if it continues unchecked in the direction it's moving, it will drag the entire world down with it. Not just the United States. It will take Europe, it will take Asia, it will drag the entire world down with it. Or are we able to use this as an educational tool and to make clear to the American population what this thing is? It's sort of latched onto the base of their spine and have them carve it out and then move in the direction that they are actually built to respond to, that they're built to move in, which is the evolution of the human species as a whole. In that sense, we've got a simple task, because we just have to be human. Yeah. We'd be human vocally, publicly, vocally, and frequently. As they say, early and often. Right? You want to get the idea out there that human beings respond to. Yeah, you want to expose people to classical culture, because it's just not around them. They're giving all this shit, and they don't really know why. Deep down inside themselves, they know it's shit. And you're getting all these emotional responses to it. Everybody doesn't know why they're depressed. Everybody's depressed, but they don't know why they're depressed. They're trying to figure out, what chemical imbalance do they have. And you're depressed because the world's fucked up. You should be depressed. You're depressed because you're human. That's not a bad response. You wouldn't be better. You wouldn't be a better person if you looked at the world around you and weren't depressed. If you looked at the world around you and you weren't depressed, you'd probably be a worse person. You have to ask yourself who the person is who's telling you that something's wrong with you, that you don't like this. You don't like this? You don't like this? You just need more drugs. Smoke a bowl. That's the problem. There's something wrong with that person. The fact that you're upset about this is correct. So what we need to do is figure out how to capitalize on that. How to show them that this will make you happy. Right? This is human. This is what you can respond to. And if you can show people that, if we can do that with precision, and we need to keep refining our precision in doing that. We need to get better and better at doing that. But when you do it well, people respond. Hell, it makes you happy. At that moment, you're in the zone. You're conveying an idea. At that moment, you feel your humanity, and then you can radiate that to people who are around you. And in a crisis like this, when people are ready to reflect on that, is when you can get, a real major evolutionary shift in the human species. Riemann, in his philosophical fragments, he's got this funny thing where he's describing how the human mind thinks, what creativity is, and then he says, and anybody who seriously reflects on their own thought process will realize that this is not reducible to anything simply abiotic. He's like, just an honest reflection will do that to you, implying, which is the case, that anybody who thinks anything else is a lunatic ideologue. It is just pure ideology that has made you sit back and talk yourself into something else. Because it's not. You're sort of like, you hear a beautiful musical composition, and somebody says, no, it's just sound vibrations, these separate notes. And then you hear the little, separate notes. And you're like, well, that didn't do anything to me. That's not the same thing. But then the person's just sitting back there, and they've got a degree, and they're explaining to you how they are the same thing. And after a while, you just don't want to seem stupid. So you're like, okay, well, yeah, they're the same thing. We all know that they're the same thing. But then you don't go to the record store and buy a record with, random isolated notes on it, right? If you really believed it was the same thing, that's what you'd go buy, right? Or hell, you just stand outside and listen to traffic. I mean, ultimately, those could be reorganized into the same notes. So intuitively, nobody thinks that. Nobody acts. Nobody. You don't live your life that way. Maybe you make certain kinds of you make certain sacrifices because you're supposed to think that that's the case. So you start trying to be a little more emotionally colder, more callous, and you start becoming unconcerned, pretending to be unconcerned with the well-being of your fellow man. And when you're too concerned with the well-being of your fellow man, you find some way to chemically stop yourself from being concerned with the well-being of your fellow man, or just through pure conditioning. Self-conditioning, right? If I watch enough bloody horror movies, I won't care about the fact that a bunch of Africans are dying bloody deaths. So you sit back and you condition yourself until you stop having an emotional response, and at that point you think you're better. You think you're healthier. But it's not natural. It takes a lot of work to put yourself in that state of mind. It takes a lot of maintaining. It's more effort to maintain humanity in that state than to express your natural human sympathy for the creative powers in other human beings and in yourself. So nobody really thinks that. And Riemann has this sort of funny thing where Riemann says, well, if you're really going to push it, I'll grant you the abstract possibility that you could reduce things to particles, but that won't change the argument I'm going to have. And it's true, it doesn't change any of the argument. And Curler says the same thing. He says, look, first off, no, it's not. You know from your own thought process that none of this is reducible. That what you see here is different than the sort of reductionist world that gets presented to you, which is what makes you it makes most of the population repelled by it. It's why you've got so few people in science right now, because science is such bullshit. Any real observer in the population can say that what I'm being taught in physics is not my personal experience on a day-to-day basis. And because of that, they're repulsed. They take a step back from that. But what's more is, as much as these guys want to claim that they're doing something to your, they could push it legally. The world's just a bunch of particles, so now we have to reassess what morality means. Maybe killing human beings isn't that bad, because, what are they anyway? Is it really different to kill a human being than to, break a rock? It's like, any dipshit knows that there's a difference between killing a human being and smashing a rock. There's just a real bit of sophistry to try and equate the two there. But they do it for political ends. And what we need to do right now is just figure out, you need to give the population back their authority to say that, no, this is not, what you're doing is not science, it's not knowledge about anything. They discovered nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's useful to figure out where they end up. You got the one guy who ends up spending his entire career grafting monkey testicles onto millionaires. But that's his life's work. And then I read a recent article where they say, his career has been, he's been somewhat vindicated in recent times. Don't even know why or, yeah.
It seems like he got the shot.
right. But then, then you've got the other, like this Alexis Carrel, the guy who's the head of the Society for the Solution of Human Problems, or whatever it's called, in Vichy, France. his big breakthrough, his whole life is that he manages to keep this jar of tissue culture alive for like 2 decades or some insane amount of time. And he's just growing this tissue culture separate. And he has this whole theory about how this means that since the tissue culture is living longer than the animal was taken from, I think it was like chicken tissue culture or something. So it's just decades long when the chicken would only have lived however long a chicken lives. So this means you're approaching immortality. And it's this real lunacy you've got there. And then he dies. And after he dies, a bunch of his lab assistants come out and say, well, the thing was, he was just so attached to this idea that this tissue culture could live forever that we didn't have the heart to let him down. So, every night he'd go home and we'd add some more cells to the tissue culture to keep the thing going. And so he thought it lived for these decades. And you get these guys just fucking nuts. They've contributed nothing at all to human knowledge. Nothing that's not incidental to human knowledge. Nothing substantial. Yeah, I mean, they really are sort of a useless nuisance. And the only reason that they don't really serve a usefulness, they don't even play a humorous role, is because they're evil as sin. They'd be funny if they weren't killing people. And maybe, with some distance and time from them, they'll be safely humorous. It's always intimidation. I mean, what happened in art and what happened in science after the war is no different than what happened politically. It's just like McCarthyism. What's the intimidation with all this bullshit modern art stuff? I mean, nobody likes it. People don't like it. You talk yourself into liking it because you're told that if you don't like it, something's wrong with you. You're just not intelligent enough to understand these things, You go, and then there's always the argument. You're like, I don't like seeing that guy shot. It kind of made me feel bad. Well, you're just weak. You don't want to be weak, do you? What are you, some kind of, emotional sop? What do you're just always moved by these human emotions? Aren't you above that? And then of course everybody's, oh yes, I'm above that. Oh yes, shoot him. I don't care. I've got no emotional response to that. Same thing they do with the modern art, right? Oh yes, it makes perfect sense. And somebody, it's just a square. All you're looking at is a square. What do you mean it makes perfect sense? It doesn't mean anything different than any other square you saw. It's got a stain on it, I saw a slab of concrete that looked the same. It was a square with a stain on it. Did that move you as much as this square on the wall moved you? And the same thing in science is the same thing. And people know this is crap. They know it has nothing to do with how they know the world works. The universe is fundamentally statistical. And you're like, really? And then they'll extrapolate it. So that means there's no causality in the universe. You're just imagining causality. You're like, really? So, I just moved that picture right there, and I just think that I caused it to move? Really? It was all statistical? All right. It's like, you don't think that. That's not true. You don't believe that. It's just intimidation because you want to seem intelligent, and you don't want to be an outcast from all the people who are intelligent. So, oh, yes. It was all statistical, Things just happened to work out that way. The evolution of the human species, it's a thermodynamic miracle, really. Everything was moving towards chaos and disorder and heat death, and then one molecule happened to move in just the right direction, like knock them together and form, like a protein. Little amino acids in the protein are like forming themselves. You've got an organism walking, and it just goes on like that for millions of years until you get, human beings walking around. But it's sort of like a backwards domino game, and that's all by accident, right? This is all statistical chance. Nobody believes that. Nobody thinks that way. But it's out of intimidation that people have to think that way. It's all political intimidation. It's no different, and it's not a coincidence that it all comes on the scene in that form at the same time as McCarthyism in this post-World War II period. Why try to corrupt all these individuals, when you can just corrupt everything they know? Yeah, so the funding goes in, so you'll find these lunatics, these people with absolutely evil political intentions are pouring money into cultural projects, into modern music, into reductionist science. They'll pour their money there, and they get the political ends they want. Or at the very least, you get a population that's susceptible to the political program you're pushing. It's exactly. right? You give them sort of a stupid wannabe philosophy, take the real humanist philosophy away from them, right? No more studying of the dead white European males, and instead you're going to, investigate like the inside of an asshole on acid. And then with that, then, the acceptance of free trade is not a very big leap from there. If you're a radical environmentalist, you can't really be too upset about what's happening in Africa. So you get these people who think they're radical leftists, they're trying to save a tree. The financial establishment doesn't give a shit about trees. They don't fucking care. You can burn all, you can keep the trees, you can burn the trees. They're killing human beings, and they're just happy that you're not worried about the fact that they're killing human beings. You as a leftist sort of have a distaste for human beings anyway. And they're fine with that. In that sense, you guys you get governed by the exact same ideology. There's no difference there between the radical right and the radical left.